Medieval peasants were everyday heroes who endured brutal winters with little more than grit and creativity. Their homes, tiny mud and stick huts, offered almost no insulation, just thin walls patched with dung and straw, drafty roofs, and dirt floors that turned to mud when it rained. Nights were freezing, fires weak, and warmth scarce unless you were huddled inches from the hearth. Clothing was minimal: rough wool layers, goat-scented cloaks, and no cozy bedding, just hay-stuffed sacks, often shared with fleas. Glass windows were a luxury. Most had animal skins or wooden shutters. The wind crept through every crack, making the indoors only slightly warmer than outside. Yet, peasants stuffed gaps with moss, shared body heat, and used whatever they had, including sheep grease, to fight off the cold. Surviving the night was a win. The cold, inside and out, was relentless, but so was their determination. Cold rose from the ground like a ghost, seeping through straw and into your bones. Drop something at night? It froze instantly. Peasants fought back with straw or rushes on the floor if they could steal or gather enough, but it flattened, rotted, and crackled underfoot. Over time, layers of old plant matter turned into damp, flea-filled padding. Beds weren't much better, just wooden frames with straw that poked and shifted, offering little warmth. Sleep was less rest and more a battle to keep blood flowing. But the real winter hero wasn't the roof or walls. It was the hearth, a smoky pit at the heart of the home, with no chimney, just smoke drifting through cracks or into your lungs. Still, it gave warmth, light, cooked meals, and kept pests away. Families took turns feeding it with sticks, peat, or rare dry wood, because if the fire died, so might they. It was their only real shield against the cold and their flickering lifeline through the long, freezing nights. Restarting a fire in winter wasn't just hard, it could be deadly. With no matches or lighters, peasants relied on flint and steel, frozen fingers, and prayers to spark a flame. To avoid this, they banked the fire, burying embers in ash at night to keep them alive until morning. Done right, a few pokes and fresh wood brought the fire back. Done wrong, you woke up freezing. Fire banking was a family skill, passed down like a recipe, with debates over the best technique. But even a banked fire could fail. Wind could snuff it out, or a sheep might wander into the hearth. So families took turns checking the coals through the night. When the fire wasn't enough, they turned to each other. Entire households huddled in corners, wrapped in scraps, layered like a snoring human lasagna. Kids slept in the middle. Elders and livestock added warmth. Comfort didn't matter. Survival did. Personal space was forgotten, replaced by body heat and bonding. Even animals joined in, not just for warmth, but to prevent theft. A crowded, stinky, noisy house became a furnace of life against the cold. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs lounged near the fire, and cows sprawled against the walls like paying tenants. The smell? Unforgettable. But peasants tolerated it. More animals meant more warmth and fewer frozen toes. Cows got the warmest spots, goats squeezed in, and pigs plopped down wherever they wanted. Sharing space with livestock had risks, like chickens nesting in your hair or stepping in mystery messes. Still, warmth mattered more than comfort. Fashion wasn't for looks, it was survival. Peasants wore every piece they owned: linen tunics, wool layers, sagging leggings, rough cloaks, maybe a sheepskin. Footwear was cloth-wrapped feet in wooden clogs. Washing clothes in winter was a frozen nightmare, so most skipped it, accepting that layers of dirt, sweat, and smoke at least helped trap body heat. And let's not forget the bedfellows. In a medieval peasant home, you didn't sleep alone. Your mattress of straw or rushes was shared with fleas, bugs, and whatever small critters happened to sneak in. Add to that your family members, livestock nearby, and a general cloud of smells, and comfort was the least of your concerns. Over time, the sleeping area became a mashup of crushed plants, crumbs, mud, and mystery grime. Replacing the bedding wasn't routine. It happened when the straw started to rot, crawl, or stink too much to ignore. But for peasants, even that messy pile was better than nothing. If it kept you off the freezing dirt floor and slightly warmer through a bitter night, it was worth every poke, creak, and cough. In a world where every degree of heat could mean survival, a bed of wilted rushes and hay was a luxury not to be taken lightly. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. These staggered sleep shifts meant someone was always awake to fight back the cold, keep the fire alive, and make sure the house didn't quietly freeze over in the dead of night. It was a gritty, half-conscious dance of survival, fueled by sheer will and the faint warmth of glowing embers. If you were lucky, you'd catch 2 or 3 hours of shivery rest before being roused by a sibling's poke or the snort of a pig claiming your spot. And when morning finally came, it wasn't greeted with birdsong or sunshine. It was the slow, aching realization that you survived another night. Your reward? A cold floor, stale bread, and another day of patching leaks, scrounging for firewood, and trying to stay one step ahead of frostbite. But for medieval peasants, survival itself was a kind of victory. Every night that ended with smoke still rising from the hearth, and all your toes intact was a win. Rough, smoky, itchy, but still a win. Sometimes there was barley or rye bread to soak up the broth, and if they were lucky, maybe even a scrap of salted meat or a bone to gnaw on. Fat was precious. Lard, suet, or drippings were stirred into whatever was cooking to add both calories and warmth. These meals weren't gourmet, but they were fuel. Survival fuel. Grains like porridge were a common bedtime meal, dense, bland, but belly-filling. It wasn't about taste, it was about staying warm. A hot meal in your stomach before crawling into a drafty straw bed meant your body had something to burn through the night, like tossing a log on an internal fire. Children were often given warm broth before sleep, sometimes more water than stew, but even that tiny bit of heat helped. It wasn't just nourishment, it was comfort, a rare moment of warmth in an otherwise brutal season. Families huddled together, bowls in hand, steam rising into the smoky rafters, knowing full well that every bite was another degree of defense. So while medieval peasants may not have had electric blankets or space heaters, they understood the power of a full belly. In a world where every night was a fight against frost, soup and porridge were armor, and dinner was a form of survival. People didn't argue about who snored or hogged the blanket. They jockeyed for heat zones. The hearth wasn't just the center of the home, it was the gravitational pull everything orbited around. Even pets and livestock crept closer at night, drawn to the faint warmth. Chickens might roost nearby, a goat might nestle near your feet, and if the family dog was allowed indoors, he was definitely curling up by the fire like royalty. You didn't shoo him away. That dog was a space heater with legs. Of course, this human heat map meant your sleeping experience depended heavily on your rank in the household, and how fast you could claim a good spot. End up on the outer edge, and congratulations, you were now a wind buffer for the rest of the family. It wasn't uncommon to wake up halfway into the night and inchworm your way closer to the fire, hoping to steal a bit more heat without waking anyone or getting an elbow to the ribs. Despite the ash, the smoke, the occasional stray ember popping toward your bed, the hearth was the undisputed MVP of medieval winter nights. Every flicker of flame was a whisper of life, a promise that morning might actually come without frostbite. And so, every night, in homes filled with smoke, snoring, and the scent of turnip stew, medieval peasants huddled close, clinging to warmth, firelight, and the sheer, stubborn will to survive another frozen dawn. Here is the full paragraph translated into fluent, natural English. When the fire went out, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. In the dead of winter, when the last ember faded to black, any hope of surviving the night faded with it. The cold didn't politely knock. It crept in through every crack, into lungs, freezing breath, and delivering death in silence. Entire families could freeze together, lying motionless beneath threadbare blankets, only to be discovered days later, silent witnesses to a brutal truth. Winter followed no rules, showed no mercy. In the village, there were no grand funerals. The dead were buried quickly beneath the frozen ground, with whispered prayers and lowered eyes. Grief couldn't linger, not because the living didn't care, but because they had to keep living. You honored the dead by chopping more wood, patching the thatch, and holding your children tighter beside the fire. Winter was the great equalizer. Whether you were a blacksmith, a shepherd, or the lazy nephew of the village reeve, everyone heard the ticking of the same survival clock. Make it to spring, or don't. And yet, amidst the cold, the hunger, and the loss, people still hoped. They sowed seeds with trembling hands, patched worn boots with scraps of cloth, and told stories by the fire as if laughter itself could melt frost. They dreamed of warmer days, not because they were naive, but because they were resilient. That, above all, made them more than survivors. It made them human. So the next time you're buried under 3 blankets, muttering about a draft slipping through the window, remember the medieval peasants who faced winter armed with ash, turnips, and sheer, uncrushable willpower. Their world was harsh, cruel, and short, but it was bound together by grit, community, and a fierce determination to breathe through one more frozen night. Let me know if you'd like a version optimized for narration, subtitle timing, or social media post style. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with powerful family connections. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple. She was just another noble girl, one of many, expected to marry well, bear children, and advance her family's interests quietly from behind the scenes. But Anne was never meant to stay quiet. From a young age, she stood apart. Sharp-witted, quick-tongued, and fiercely intelligent, she was sent abroad to the Netherlands, and then to the glittering court of France. There, she absorbed the sophistication, politics, and power games of continental royalty, lessons that would serve her well in the treacherous halls of Henry VIII's court. By the time she returned to England, Anne wasn't just another lady-in-waiting. She was a force waiting to be reckoned with, and soon the king noticed. But Henry was determined. His love, or perhaps obsession, for Anne Boleyn had ignited more than courtly gossip. It had sparked a constitutional crisis. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry didn't back down. Instead, he broke with Rome. What followed was nothing short of revolutionary. In 1533, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing centuries of papal authority. And at the heart of it all stood Anne. Their secret marriage took place in January of that year, and by June, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. For Anne, it was a triumph, the culmination of years of calculated patience and impossible risk. But it also marked the beginning of her greatest challenge. She had ascended not just a throne, but a throne built on the rubble of tradition, scandal, and broken loyalties. The pressure was immense. She was expected to produce a male heir to legitimize the break from Rome and secure the Tudor dynasty. In September 1533, Anne gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. While Henry masked his disappointment, the court whispered. Anne's position, once untouchable, was now precarious. She was no longer the mysterious flame who had captivated the king. She was the queen, burdened with expectation, surrounded by enemies, and trapped in a role that demanded perfection in an imperfect world. Still, Anne was no stranger to court intrigue. She fought to maintain her influence, supported religious reformers, and remained a sharp political thinker. But time was not on her side. Henry, always restless, began to drift. His eyes wandered, and so did his affections, eventually landing on another lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne, who had once held Henry's heart in the palm of her hand, now found herself the target of venomous rumors and calculated betrayals. In May 1536, just 3 years after her dazzling coronation, she was arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was flimsy. The motives were political, but the outcome was certain. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the steps of the scaffold at the Tower of London. Dressed in a dark gray gown and a red underskirt, she addressed the crowd with composure and dignity. She did not confess. She did not beg. She knelt, prayed, and with a single stroke of a French sword, her life was ended. Yet even in death, Anne Boleyn's story did not fade. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign ushered in an age of exploration, cultural brilliance, and national pride. Anne's legacy lived not only through Elizabeth, but in the enduring impact she had on the English church, monarchy, and national identity. She had dared to reach for more than what her world permitted, and though the fall was brutal, the mark she left on history remains unshakable. Anne was not simply a figurehead, she was a political force. She championed reformist ideas, protected early Protestant thinkers, and filled the court with scholars and loyalists who shared her vision of a modern, independent England. But her brilliance, ambition, and unmistakable confidence also made her enemies, powerful ones. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's trusted advisor, whose own reformist leanings were rooted more in political control than Anne's moral convictions. Their alliance, once beneficial, soon soured into rivalry. Meanwhile, Anne's position grew increasingly unstable. Each passing month without a male heir chipped away at the foundation beneath her. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage, then another. The pressure mounted. Henry's gaze turned cold, his affections drifting toward a quieter, more compliant lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Where Anne had challenged Henry, Jane comforted him. Where Anne sparked controversy, Jane promised peace. By early 1536, Anne's fate was all but sealed. In January, Catherine of Aragon died, and Anne's enemies took it as a sign, divine permission perhaps, that her time was up. A final tragic miscarriage, reportedly of a male child, occurred just days after Catherine's death. To Henry, this was not just personal sorrow, it was a grim omen. Within weeks, whispers turned to accusations: adultery, incest, treason, charges so grotesque they would have been laughable if not for the deadly seriousness behind them. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Her trial was a spectacle, more theater than justice. The evidence was fabricated, the verdict predetermined. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were also condemned. On May 19, 1536, Anne was executed by a skilled French swordsman, chosen by Henry as a final gesture of mercy. She died with dignity, declaring her innocence and praying for the king who had condemned her. But Anne Boleyn's story did not end on the scaffold. Though vilified in her lifetime, history has come to see her not simply as a tragic queen or a pawn in a king's obsession, but as a brilliant, brave, and complex woman who helped reshape the very fabric of English identity. Through her daughter, Elizabeth I, Anne's legacy soared beyond anything even she could have imagined. The child once seen as a disappointment became one of the greatest monarchs in history, leading England into a golden age of culture, exploration, and strength. Anne Boleyn was never just a mistress or a queen. She was a storm that changed the weather, a spark that lit the fire of reform, and a woman who defied the limits of her age. She rose not because of favor or fortune, but because of wit, courage, and conviction. And though the crown cost her everything, her name, unlike so many, was never forgotten. Cromwell's plan was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He began collecting rumors, idle court gossip, bitter mutterings from spurned courtiers, and anything that could be twisted into a charge of treason. The accusations were outrageous: adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. But in the volatile world of Henry VIII's court, truth mattered less than perception, and perception could be manipulated. Anne was arrested on May 2, 1536. She was taken to the Tower of London, the very place where she had once arrived in triumph for her coronation. Now, she entered through the Traitor's Gate. She protested her innocence with calm dignity, even as her friends and family were swept up in the storm, her brother George among them. One by one, the accused were interrogated, tortured, and forced to confess to crimes they never committed. Anne's trial was a farce, more performance than justice. The verdict was already written, the sentence already sealed. On May 15, 1536, she was found guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. The punishment was death. 4 days later, Anne Boleyn faced the executioner. She wore a simple gray gown and a crimson cloak, her long dark hair tucked beneath a coif, her gaze steady, her voice calm. She made no protest of innocence, no curse upon her enemies, only a prayer for her soul and loyalty to the king who had destroyed her. On May 19, 1536, Anne knelt on the scaffold. With a single, swift stroke from a French swordsman, her life ended, but her legacy did not. Anne Boleyn's death shocked Europe. A queen executed on trumped-up charges was unprecedented. But in her fall, Anne sealed her place in history. Her daughter, Elizabeth, once dismissed as the product of a failed union, would go on to become one of the most legendary monarchs England had ever known. Anne had risked everything for a crown, and though it cost her her life, she helped redefine what it meant to be a queen. She was not born to rule, but she challenged a king, transformed a nation, and bore a child who would carry her legacy into the golden age of English power. History did not forget Anne Boleyn. It remembered her as a woman of wit, daring, and defiance. A woman who rose beyond her station and paid the price for ambition, but whose bloodline changed the course of an empire. She walked with steady steps to the scaffold, flanked by guards, her eyes fixed ahead, not on the executioner, but on the horizon. The small crowd gathered in silence. Some had come out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity. A few bowed their heads in sorrow. Many said nothing at all. The air was heavy, as if the very stones of the tower held their breath. Anne mounted the steps without faltering. She turned to the people and spoke, not with anger or bitterness, but with grace. She praised the king, the very man who had condemned her, calling him a kind and gracious Lord. She asked those present to pray for her soul and to hold no ill will. Her final words were quiet, but unshaken. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The executioner, a skilled swordsman from Calais, waited patiently as Anne knelt upright on the straw-covered platform. Her ladies tied a blindfold gently across her eyes, and Anne arranged her skirt so she would fall with dignity. She repeated her prayers softly, over and over. Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul. With one swift, clean stroke, it was over. Anne Boleyn died on May 19, 1536. She was just 35. Her body was placed in an arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower grounds. No grand procession, no royal tomb, just silence and stone. But though Anne was silenced that day, history would not forget her. She had risen from the fringes of nobility to the throne of England. She had captivated a king, challenged a church, and given birth to a future queen. Her story was not just one of scandal or betrayal. It was one of ambition, courage, and transformation. Elizabeth I, her daughter, would later rule England with a strength and brilliance that echoed her mother's spirit. In her, Anne's legacy would rise again, not in shame, but in triumph. Centuries later, the world still speaks her name. Anne Boleyn, controversial, complex, and unforgettable. A queen not remembered for how she died, but for how fiercely she lived. In the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered with growing unrest. Their relationship with Britain, once marked by loyalty and pride, had soured into resentment and defiance. Years of parliamentary taxes, beginning with the Stamp Act and followed by the Townshend Acts, had ignited a deep frustration. Though the taxes were modest by British standards, it was not the cost, but the principle that enraged the colonists: taxation without representation. Cities like Boston became the epicenters of resistance. Groups like the Sons of Liberty led boycotts, published fiery pamphlets, and organized protests that challenged British authority. Tensions boiled over in 1770 during the Boston Massacre, when British troops fired on unarmed civilians. Trust was broken. By 1773, the colonies stood at the edge of open rebellion. That final spark came not through soldiers or new laws, but through tea. Parliament, hoping to rescue the struggling British East India Company, passed the Tea Act, which allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price. But the law left in place the hated tax on tea. To accept the tea, even at a discount, would be to acknowledge Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. For many Americans, this was intolerable. In cities across the colonies, ships carrying tea were turned away or their cargo left to rot. But in Boston, resistance took a more dramatic turn. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships docked in Boston Harbor: the Dartmouth, the Illinois, and the Beaver. They opened 342 chests and dumped the tea into the icy waters. No one was harmed. No other cargo was touched. It was not an act of anarchy, but a message. Liberty was worth more than comfort, and defiance was a duty. The British government responded with fury. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, closed Boston's port, stripped its government of power, and allowed British troops to occupy private homes. Instead of intimidating the colonies, Britain had united them. In response, delegates from all 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. They came from diverse regions and beliefs, but stood together in declaring that enough was enough. The road to revolution had begun, not with gunfire, but with ideas, unity, and bold acts of protest. The Boston Tea Party, with its quiet fury and uncompromising principle, became a turning point. Though no one that night could have foreseen it, the ripples from that harbor would cross oceans, challenge empires, and forever reshape the world. As December 16, 1773, dawned gray and cold over Boston, the city stood at a historic precipice. For nearly 3 weeks, 3 British tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, had sat anchored in Boston harbor like powder kegs, their cargo untouched, the tension mounting by the hour. British law was clear. If the tea was not unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of arrival, customs officials would seize the cargo and enforce the payment, by force if necessary. That day had come. Inside the old South Meeting House, thousands of colonists gathered in anxious defiance. The hall, packed shoulder to shoulder with farmers, artisans, merchants, and patriots, pulsed with urgency. The air was thick with the breath of the crowd and the weight of impending action. Samuel Adams, one of the leading voices of resistance, addressed the assembly one final time. What he said was brief, but it carried the force of thunder. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It was the signal. That evening, as dusk fell, a group of about 60 men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, emerged from the shadows. They marched down to Griffin's Wharf with silent purpose. No drunken mob, no random chaos. This was an organized protest, a deliberate act of political rebellion. They boarded the 3 ships and began opening the 342 chests of British East India Company tea. One by one, they dumped the contents into the freezing black water of the harbor. Thousands watched from the docks and nearby buildings in solemn awe. Not a single chest was stolen. No other cargo was touched. The act was swift, precise, and symbolically devastating. In total silence, except for the splash of tea into the harbor, the message was delivered. The colonies would not be governed without their consent. The next morning, Boston woke to a transformed world. The harbor reeked of tea. Royal officials were stunned. The British government, upon hearing the news, was enraged. Parliament responded with swift vengeance, passing the coercive acts, dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, which closed the port of Boston, dissolved Massachusetts' self-government, and authorized the quartering of British troops in colonial homes. What was meant to punish Boston only united the colonies further. What happened on that cold December night was far more than a protest over taxes. It was a declaration, silent, defiant, and unforgettable. The Boston Tea Party ignited a revolution that would shake the world. From that moment, there was no going back. The road to independence had begun. It was a night unlike any other in colonial history. The Boston Tea Party, often romanticized in textbooks, was in truth a moment of stunning clarity and purpose. Under the cold cover of darkness on December 16, 1773, dozens of colonists, ordinary men turned rebels, executed a perfectly coordinated act of political defiance. They hadn't come for violence nor for glory. They had come with a message, and they delivered it in silence, with splashes and shattered wood as their voice. When the last chest of tea hit the water, the mission was over. Not a single protester lingered. They melted back into the Boston streets like shadows, leaving behind no vandalism, no stolen goods, and no names. What they left was more powerful, a message to the British Crown and to the world. The colonies would no longer be passive subjects. They would not be coerced, bought, or ignored. By morning, word spread fast. The harbor was choked with bobbing crates and soaked tea leaves, the waters dark and bitter. British authorities were stunned. Parliament seethed. In response, the British government lashed out with a fury that only confirmed what the colonists had long feared. The coercive acts, or intolerable acts, as they quickly came to be known, shut down the port of Boston, revoked Massachusetts's charter, and gave imperial power the right to quarter troops in colonial homes. But far from weakening resistance, this crackdown ignited it. Across the colonies, sympathy for Boston turned into solidarity. What had begun as a protest in one city became a unifying cause. For the first time, the idea of a united stand, a Congress of Colonies, began to take shape. Just months later, in 1774, the First Continental Congress would meet in Philadelphia, and the seeds of independence, planted in Boston Harbor, began to grow. The Boston Tea Party was not just about tea, it was about principle. It was about who held power and who deserved a voice. It was the moment a group of colonists, fed up with a distant king and an indifferent parliament, chose to resist, not with weapons, but with will. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was unforgettable. That night, Boston didn't just dump tea into the sea. It poured the first drops of revolution into the tide of history. Pamphlets flew off the presses, demanding action. In taverns, churches, and homes, talk of loyalty gave way to talk of liberty. No longer were these colonies simply quarreling provinces under a distant king. They were fast becoming a people with a common cause. What Britain had intended as a warning had instead sparked the unthinkable: American unity. Committees of correspondence, once local efforts to share news, now grew into a vast network linking towns and colonies. Plans began to form. Whispers turned to resolutions. If the Crown could punish one colony, the others would stand with it. This was not just about tea or taxation anymore. It was about rights, justice, and self-determination. A Congress was proposed, a gathering of colonial leaders to decide what to do next. For the first time in history, the scattered colonies prepared to speak with one voice. In the summer of 1774, representatives from 12 colonies journeyed to Philadelphia. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams entered the halls of the First Continental Congress, not yet revolutionaries, but determined defenders of American liberty. They debated, they argued, and they ultimately agreed. The colonies must resist. They pledged mutual support, called for a boycott of British goods, and demanded the repeal of the intolerable acts. But they also sent a petition to King George III, a final olive branch, hoping to avoid full-scale war. That hope, however, was fragile, already cracking under the weight of British intransigence. Across the Atlantic, the Crown had no intention of backing down. British troops fortified their positions. Colonial militias drilled in open fields. Something irreversible had begun. Boston may have been the spark, but now the fire was spreading. Unstoppable, untamed. What had started as a protest over tea had ignited a revolution. And soon, across fields and forests, rivers and ridges, muskets would be raised, and history would be rewritten. They were declaring, in the most dramatic and unambiguous way possible, that their rights were not granted by kings, but inherent to all free people. What happened on that cold December night was more than an act of protest. It was a turning point. It marked the beginning of the end for British rule in America. From that moment forward, the path was clear, though perilous. Reconciliation became increasingly impossible. Trust between colony and crown eroded completely. As British redcoats marched and colonial militias organized, the colonies stood on the threshold of war. But they were no longer 13 divided outposts. They were 13 united colonies, slowly becoming one nation. A nation forged not in quiet diplomacy or royal favor, but in open defiance, bold action, and the unwavering belief that liberty was worth fighting for. And so, with each passing month, the revolution gathered strength. The ideals that had been born in taverns and meeting houses now echoed through hills and valleys, across towns and cities. The world would soon witness the birth of something new, something radical. A republic governed not by monarchs, but by the people themselves. The Boston Tea Party was just the beginning. They were connected, woven into a vibrant network of exchange that spanned vast distances. Though they left no written records, the remnants of their culture spoke volumes. Musical instruments like flutes and panpipes have been uncovered, suggesting that music played a vital role in their society, not just as entertainment, but likely in ceremonies, gatherings, and rituals that bound their people together. At the heart of Caral lay its greatest monuments, massive pyramids that stood not as tombs, like those of Egypt, but as stages for public life. These structures were civic, ceremonial, and perhaps even scientific in purpose. Some archaeologists believe they were aligned with celestial events, pointing to a people deeply in tune with the cosmos. Others suggest they served as gathering places for decision-making and community celebration, early symbols of organized, peaceful government. What makes Caral all the more remarkable is what it lacked. No signs of war, no fortifications, no weapons, no evidence of violent conquest. This was not a civilization forged through blood and domination, but through cooperation, trade, and shared vision. In a world where so many early cultures were built around kings and armies, Caral stood apart as a peaceful anomaly. Its rise remains a testament to human resilience, creativity, and the ability to thrive even in the harshest environments. And its rediscovery, buried under millennia of dust and silence, reminds us that the story of civilization is far older and far richer than we once imagined. Caral rewrote our understanding of the Americas, proving that complex society did not begin with the Inca or the Aztecs, but long before, in a desert valley, where a forgotten people dreamed grand dreams under the blazing sun. And this was just the beginning of what the ancient Americas still have to reveal. Before war-shaped empires and kings ruled with iron fists, there was a place where music, stone, and stars told the story of a people who chose peace over power. That place was Caral. In the arid valleys of coastal Peru, where life seemed nearly impossible, Caral thrived. It wasn't merely a settlement. It was a planned city of astonishing complexity, built without the wheel, without metal tools, and without writing. What the people of Caral lacked in technology, they made up for with vision, unity, and determination. They saw not a desert, but a canvas. With patience and innovation, they tamed the seasonal floods of the Supe River, developing simple yet effective irrigation systems that turned dust into green. Cotton, beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes flourished. Cotton, especially, became a vital resource, woven into fishing nets and traded with distant coastal villages, forming networks of exchange that stretched far beyond their own valley. At the heart of Caral stood its massive pyramids, monumental structures of stone and earth that rivaled the early wonders of the world. The largest, the Pyramid Mare, extended over 450 feet in length and rose nearly 60 feet into the sky. Built to endure both time and tremors, these pyramids were not tombs, but vibrant centers of ceremony, ritual, and community life. Atop their platforms, fires once burned under the stars, and rituals were held to honor gods, seasons, and one another. Broad plazas, sunken, circular, and acoustically powerful, invited the community to gather, not for war or defense, but for unity. In fact, among all that has been uncovered at Caral, there is something profoundly unique. No weapons, no defensive walls, no signs of conquest or violence. Unlike so many ancient civilizations, Caral appears to have been built on peace, sustained through collaboration, trade, and shared belief. Leadership rested not on military strength, but on spiritual authority and civic coordination. The city's layout, its pyramids aligned with celestial events, its gathering spaces designed for harmony, reflects a people deeply attuned to the cosmos and to each other. Music, too, was a vital force. In a society without writing, music became the language of memory and meaning. Archaeologists have uncovered a remarkable collection of instruments: flutes made from condor and pelican bones, whistles carved from deer antlers, drums stretched with animal hides. Tuned to specific notes and designed to resonate across wide plazas, these instruments carried the voice of a people who celebrated life through sound. Rituals were rich with music, echoing through the desert, weaving together the spiritual and the social, the personal and the collective. Caral flourished not through domination, but through connection. Its trade networks brought in colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, and tropical fruits from faraway valleys. These exchanges stitched together a peaceful web of interdependence, with Caral as a cultural and economic hub at its heart. The people invested not in walls, but in plazas, not in armies, but in knowledge and celebration. And then, around 1800 BCE, Caral fell silent. No invasion, no destruction. Life simply withdrew. The fires were extinguished, the plazas emptied. Whether due to climate change, shifting trade, or dwindling resources, the city was abandoned. For millennia, it lay buried under wind and sand, forgotten by history. But now, as archaeologists uncover its stones, Caral rises once more. Its story of peace, ingenuity, and community has not vanished. It was not just a city of buildings and trade. It was a city alive with sound, ceremony, and rhythm. And in a world so often shaped by conflict, Caral offers something rare, a reminder that civilization can rise not on the backs of the conquered, but through the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. Caral still speaks to us, and it still has so much to teach. Imagine it. The low thrum of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping in rhythm on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered beneath the fading light. Fires flickered atop the pyramid platforms, casting dancing shadows, while priests, robed in intricately woven garments, chanted to the gods of the river, the earth, and the stars. In those moments, Caral was more than just a city. It was a symphony. The very design of Caral speaks of ritual as its lifeblood. Grand plazas were not simply open spaces, but intentional gathering grounds, crafted to unite the community. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters, concentrating sound and sight onto the sacred performances held at their centers. Above them, the pyramids rose, not as tombs, but as sacred man-made mountains connecting the earth to the heavens. These rituals likely marked the passage of time, the shifting of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, and the celestial patterns above. Music was not merely entertainment, it was a sacred bridge, linking people to each other, to the natural world, and to the divine. Unlike many ancient civilizations, there were no murals of violence, no gods of war demanding blood. Instead, Caral's spiritual life was filled with harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the wind whistles through the ruins, one can almost hear echoes of those ancient melodies, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, purpose, and connection amidst a harsh and unforgiving land. But Caral was more than just ritual and music. It was a marvel of engineering. In one of the most extreme environments on Earth, without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals, the people of Caral constructed a lasting city of stone and earth that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were astonishing,